Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairy Tales. If you've never been here before, my name is Rory, and you're watching Varietal Literature, which is a channel dedicated to a group of writers in Vancouver who enjoy narrative in its many forms. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to read some old folk tales. Well, I usually say fairy tales, but tonight's pretty exclusively folk tales. And I think there's an important distinction to be made there, but I'm not just going to make it yet. Hello, Smudge. You come to knock things over. Smudge would like to say hello. Actually, Smudge hates saying hello. This is my kitty, Smudge. Hello, Smudge. Yes, you don't want to be here. Okay. He's probably going to try it again, honestly. No, that's okay. That's okay. We're going to go that way. Yeah, there you go. Anyways, if you just want to get to the stories and you're not watching this live, down in the description below there will be little timestamps you can click on to jump ahead to beginning of any of the 7 plus stories we're going to read tonight. Now you might say, how can you read 7 stories in an hour? Well, some of these are a little longer and some of them are quite condensed, and that brings me to the folktale thing. Folktales and fairy tales have kind of a common lineage, I guess. Sort of. Folktales are a more defined lineage, though, in the sense that they definitely didn't come from single authors. They come from communities, and they tend to be stories that are taken to be real and serious. You know, maybe not so much anymore, but it can be fairly assumed that at the time, telling a story about a rock that scared horses, which was a story we told last week, it was framed as a real explanation as to something that happened locally to whatever town had that folktale. So folktales are framed as real. They're not necessarily for kids. This is not a show particularly targeted at kids. I don't think there's anything too questionable tonight, but there is a lot of death. But fairy tales, on the other hand, they have a mixture of origins. Some fairy tales are sort of folk tales that get more structured later as authors take on their own versions of it. Some of them are ostensibly created by single authors, although even those ones probably came from folk tales that they just aren't crediting. And, you know, in that you get the rule of threes and romance and whatever else. We're going to be doing folktales tonight, and the reason why I'm making this distinction, that most people who watch the show regularly know that, is because the stories tonight are ostensibly about real people who met real circumstances that in some way killed them. So, what I'm going to say is tonight's theme is basically stuff where people die in the end. So spoiler alert on every story. And it's not really clear how it connects. The stories obviously want to connect them, and given that they're supposed to be true stories, you can see them as cautionary tales. They were cautionary tales about things not to do, and some of those things are bizarrely basic. You know, there's a story we have coming up in a little bit here called The Maid Fetches the Alpine Sieve, which, again, spoiler alert, she dies for basically making pudding in the wrong house. You know, like, that's at least the connection that's drawn. And so for those reasons, I'm curious, as we go through this, what do you think each of these stories is trying to tell you? What it's trying to warn you against? If you are not watching this live and you want to give your own theories on each of the stories we read about today, you can put it in the comments below. If you're watching it live, though, there's a live chat, and I see GS is here. Hello, GS. She says, good evening. Smudge is on theme. In that he's going to eat me. So, that's just a little bit on what we're doing. If you do enjoy the show tonight, consider subscribing, because we do lots of folktale streams and fairy tale streams every Tuesday. We also do some other stuff, but I'll deal with that when I'm running that show. So our first section here is a series of stories based around some concepts in Norwegian language and Nordic folklore. It comes from Simon Roy Hughes, who is a translator. Sorry, I should say it's translated by Simon Roy Hughes, but the commentary I'm going to open with also comes from Simon Roy Hughes directly. It's not just a translation, to my understanding. And that's because Simon Roy Hughes runs a blog where he puts up translated materials on a variety of things from Norwegian folklore, and you should definitely check it out. If you're watching live, it won't be there right now, but if you're not watching live, there'll be a pinned comment below with all the translators' info if you want to follow up on that. And so we're going to open with essentially reading a blog post that contains about 4 stories, I think, that we're going to read anyways, about some concepts that I guess you would call premonition. Also kind of curses. Also kind of just ghosts being weird. But they all end with someone's death. So, and the cause of which is either obscure, banal, or unpredictable. And that is sort of tonight's theme, and then we'll go on to some German tales after this. Okay. So I'm going to read most of the commentary that opens this. And then I will get to the stories, but again, check the description. The stories will be tagged individually. So the following commentary comes from Simon Roy Hughes' blog post. Simon Roy Hughes is a translator of Norwegian folklore, and you can support him using the pinned Patreon in the pinned comment below, or you can go to the blog in the comment pinned below. I'm going to read his commentary and then stories related to the concepts in the commentary. And the commentary is about the Hugh, the Vardøger, and the Fylgje, which are concepts in Norwegian language. The Hugh, pronounced Hug, is an interesting relic of the pre-Christian Norse worldview, in that one of Odin's ravens was called Hugin, which is the same word in Old Norse. The other raven is Munin, and I won't go into the rest of this. Hug is still a current word in Norwegian, meaning mind or thought. Okamihug means to come in mind or thought, and is how Norwegians express to remember, to sort of bring to mind. Vardøger, which I still feel like I'm saying wrong, so I apologize for that, Simon, is a working of the word hug, described as a kind of premonitionary déjà vu. A recurring experience, common even today, is when someone in the house hears a key in the front door, a footfall on the stair, the sound of someone taking off and storing their outer clothing, only for there to be no one behind the noises. Then a while later, the same sounds will be heard again, but this time the person will enter the building. So these are strange concepts, right? Like, they are strange in that I think they are relatable, but they are quite specific. And then finally, what most of the stories come to concern here is Fylgja. A Fylgja, a companion or a follower, appears to be a further concretization, that's English, so I should be able to do that, of the Vardøger. Here, a spirit will manifest to act on behalf of its host. I have read somewhere that if you meet your Fylgja, you will die, which means the nautical draugen, which we've looked at the draug before. They're, ghosts of the sea, drowned people, kind of zombie-ish. Ride on a half boat. We've done that before. Is a Fylgja, which is something I would have never considered, but I think they're right. Although the draug is anything but benevolent. It is all but impossible to separate Vardøger from Fylgja, and as you will see below, any distinction appears relatively unimportant to those who have had these experiences with them. Here then is a selection of legends collected in northern Norway in 1807 by Ole Tobias Olsen, all published in a book from 1912, which they are translating from. So that's the stories we're going to read. And the first story from this blog post about the Hugh, the Vardøger, and the Fylgja is the Fylgja warns of the Smith boy's death. Around 1840 in Hammerfest, a smith and his wife, who were among the most respectable folk of the town, there lived. The man had an apprentice who worked in the workshop and had his bedchamber on the first floor of the workshop, to which there was a steep staircase. One day, the smith took an order for some work for a man on one of the neighboring islands. The boy was sent over there to carry out the work and was expected to return when he, in a couple of days, was finished. The same day he should come home, his mistress, the smith's wife, stood in the kitchen cooking porridge. Let's get that going there. Then the boy steps in, dressed in his neatest blue suit for traveling, and stands by the door. The wife looks at him and wonders. She knew his work could not be finished so early, that he should not have been able to finish so early and thus be home, and soon realized that it was the boy's Fylgja that she saw before her. She wondered what this visit could mean and what the boy's Fylgja had to warn of. She thus bravely addressed the Fylgja with these words: "If you are one of the good messengers, then stand, but if you are of the evil, then go!" And as soon as she uttered these words, the figure appeared to glide out through the doorway and disappear. Now the wife ran immediately to see what direction the Fylgja went, but it was as blown away. The wife went back to her work, reflecting on the vision. Now late in the evening, the boy came home, ate, then went to bed. In the night, he got up to go outdoors, for reasons unknown, but then he stumbled over a stack of iron bars on the workshop floor and died there and then. It was then they understood that the Fylgja had wanted to warn that the boy was finished, not just with his work on the island, but also with his life's work. I think that gives us the first indication of, like, what we're talking about here. Now, our next one is also about a Fylgja, but manifest in a slightly different way. This one story is also from the same blog post about the Hugh from Simon Roy Hughes, and it is called Fru Ingjær Fylgja, which apparently means Miss Ginger or Mrs. Ginger, if Google is to be trusted. The parson Ingjær Vardøger should once travel to visit a school inwards up Melfjord. Before he traveled, he asked his wife, who was in blessed circumstances, if he dare be away from her. She replied that he could safely dare, as she was not expecting to deliver her offspring for a time yet. And with this message, the parson traveled, to stay away at most 8 days. He hurried as best as he could, and had already come as far as Räderberg on the way back, and was about a league from home, when here the bad weather forced him to seek shelter. Now, despite his determined resolution to reach home the same evening, he had to stop but the boatmen refused to shove off in such weather. The parson therefore asked the boatsmen to keep their eye on the weather and wake 'em straight away should it turn such that they could shove off. He retired with his clothes on so that he might be ready at any time to board the boat, but he lay quite awake, smoking his pipe. Until just after midnight, he saw the door suddenly open, and his wife came in and began to talk to him. She was ready for her great voyage, she said, and would he meet her? Then he would have to hurry to come straight away, and with that, she closed the door. And disappeared. Well, the parson, aghast, rose and went out. He woke the boatsmen and bade them for God's sake to hurry, so they might shove off. But the weather was just still, it's too inclement. The sea spray stood in a cloud, and it was impossible to leave shore, let alone cross Räderberg. The parson had therefore to return to his chamber. He still lay in his clothes thinking. And then the door opened again. And again he saw his wife come in. "If you want to meet me, then you must come straight away," she said, and disappeared. Again the parson got up and got hold of the boatsman. "Now we shall go," he said. "Whatever the weather, now we have to shove off." And the folk thought that the parson had a screw loose, but they let themselves be persuaded to go out to the boat and shove off from land. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when they shoved off. And 4 o'clock in the morning when they finally, with great effort and in danger of their lives, arrived ashore on Räderberg. The parson sprang out of the boat and ran to the parsonage quickly as he could. Out in the courtyard he met Madame Yuntoff. He asked her how things stood, and she replied that under the circumstances things stood not well. She bade him go upstairs to get out of his clothes and warm himself before going in to see his wife. And he did so, and sat a while in a chair in the upstairs salon, while his wife lying in the chamber below. And then the door opens, and his wife's Fylgja comes into him a third time. "If you want to bid me farewell, then come straight away," she said, and disappeared. Well, the parson sprang up aghast and rushed to the door to go downstairs, but here he fainted and remained lying until folk came and helped him up. And as soon as he had regained his senses, he had hurried into his wife, who lay already struggling for breath. She recognized him, reached out her hand. He had hardly managed to grasp it and bend himself over her before she gave up the ghost. GS says, "Oh, this Fylgja story is creepy." Okay, let me get some water and we'll carry on with these. Pardon me. Our next story also comes from the Hug blog post from Simon Roy Hughes, which again is a translation of a variety of stories around this concept of the Hug, the Vardøger, and the Fylgja. And this one is called the Fylgja as Vardøger, which will mean nothing if you didn't watch the intro. I'm sorry. Jakob Nason Shan. When Jakob Nason Shan one evening sat at a table with his folks, a Vardøger came and began to rankle some carpentry tools that lay on a shelf above his head. Both he and all his folk noticed the noise from the tools, and it repeated itself several times. "Let the tools lie," said Jacob. "When we have occasion to use them, then we will use them." Straight away, it fell quiet, and the tools were left alone. But before Jacob got up the next morning, he received a message from Pera Uslen Toftlien that his son was dead, and that he had to make a coffin for the deceased. Pera soon began to make the coffin, and in that connection he had use for those carpentry tools. It was then he understood well that it was the Fylgja of the deceased who'd been out to warn him. There is one more story here. I'm not going to read it because it is effectively the same story with two differences. The rustling is of a wood. It is to make a coffin, as it turns out. And it's for his mother, I believe. But it is otherwise a short run of the same story. And that is the examples of this kind of unique concept that we don't really have in my culture anyways, over here in Canada, if that can be called a culture. And concepts that we haven't really captured in English, to my knowledge. Of the Hug, the Vardøger, and the Fylgja. Now, with that said, though, that is not the end of our concepts of people dying from inscrutable causes. And so we're going to shift gears a little bit. Again, these things are always kind of tied together by dream logic in my way. We're going to shift it a little bit to other kind of like, I don't know, they feel similar to me, but they are arbitrary death. At least from my perspective. You might hear them and go, obviously, this person died because of this, and that makes sense to me, but it doesn't to me. And to do so, we have to move over to German folktales. Gia says, they don't have to explain how they died. These tales are so powerful in their concepts. Yeah, it's weird because they're technically stories about almost nothing, and yet they kind of... Like, what would even be the point of a spirit warning you of an inevitable fate? Especially in a way so inscrutable that you couldn't do anything with the time you had left. You wouldn't figure it out. It's very odd. But anyways, yes, that means we have to move over to Germany. Which, give me a second. Means we have to move over to Jürgen Hubert's translations, which is great because I really enjoy reading Jürgen Hubert's translations. So, let me just get another drink of water, and then we will talk about a similar concept in German folklore. Similar, we're moving a little more towards what the title of this is about, which is arbitrary deaths. Now, I think for myself, I'd said I wanted people's sort of theories around what they think these deaths are indicative of or whatever else. But I think what becomes clear to me is, like, there's definitely a sort of correlation doesn't equal causation moment with a lot of these tales, but for people who lived in a time where death felt very arbitrary or ordained by the designs of one or another god, it makes sense that you would start to think of it as like something a little more predictable and structured. Obviously, if you've ever lived through uncertain times, which pretty much everyone watching this has, certain doom is better than an uncertain doom, you know? So, moving over to our German folklore, on the same concepts of sort of arbitrary deaths at the end of the story. Our first one is from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, which is a translation by Jürgen Hubert, a collection that you can again support on his Patreon in the pinned comment below, along with Simon Roy Hughes. You should support them both. And this one is called The Headless One, which is a short little one. It touches on a concept we talked about last month, but in the month before, actually. But more in tune with our topic today. If you go into the church during the dread knellings, in the holy night, and pray there, you will soon perceive a procession of altar servants traversing through the nave of the church and into the choir. Then they will move around the high altar and leave the church on the other side. These are the people who will die in the upcoming year, and they will do so in the order in which they proceeded. Now, once it occurred that someone, according to the most common variant, the sacristan himself, went into the church during that time and stepped into the choir stall and prayed there for some time. When soon there was movement in the gallery, and in the nave of the church, and immediately after a procession of altar servants entered the choir and walked around the high altar and then returned into the nave where they suddenly vanished. The sacristan immediately recognized the people in the procession. Only the last man remained mysterious to him, as he had no head. This headless one was, of course, the sacristan himself, who died near the end of the following year after all the other altar servants had preceded him into death. So we see like a variant on the your death will be foretold to you, but you won't understand that's what's happening. So what was the point? Which brings us to the one that really inspired me to do this particular theme in the first place, and that is the Maid fetches the Alpine Sieve, which is a short one, but it was so kind of arbitrary. It just fascinated me, and I'd really love to hear what people think has happened here for her to deserve her fate. This is called The Maid Fetches the Alpine Sieve, which is a German traditional folktale translated by Jürgen Hubert in his compendium of these stories called Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles. There used to be ongoing hauntings in a certain alpine meadow near the valley of Potsdam. One fall evening during the home garden, the young men started to talk about this alpine ghost. The maid, who was well known for her bravery, didn't want to believe any of this, and when the young men promised her a large amount of money if she were to fetch the sieve from the alpine hut during the night, she immediately accepted their proposal. Her employer was greatly worried when the maid embarked on the hours-long journey. The little dog that accompanied her ran back home again when they were in the vicinity of the hut. The maid, on the other hand, went into the hut, fetched the sieve from the cellar and cooked a milk soup at the hearth fire. Then, suddenly, a gigantic, fiery man stepped towards her and shouted with a terrifying voice, "Tremble!" 3 times in a row. The maid was overcome with dread, left her milk soup where it was, and ran back home with the sieve at a breakneck pace. There she met her employer, who was kneeling on the floor with widespread arms and prayed for her. The maid became very ill soon after and died of consumption within the year. Now, when I first read this, I was like, okay, yeah, it's an interesting story about being curious and, watch out for the dark woods. And then she dies of tuberculosis. Now, admittedly, at the time that this would have happened, tuberculosis is the leading cause of most people's deaths. Like, I think at the turn of the century, tuberculosis, which is what consumption is, was the leading cause of death in North America. So I would imagine that stretches out through history across lots of places. It's a lung infection that we can deal with now, but couldn't then. Just Sleece It Out says, milk soup. A soup made with milk. I'm sorry for the unsatisfying explanation, but when you're a farmer in that time, certain things were pretty replenishable, and so you would use it for many things that we may not so much use now. But cream is a thing that we use in soup. It could be also a one of the sweeter puddings that sometimes are made. Because there is a way of making a kind of sweet pudding milk thing on a stovetop, but I suspect it's just sort of a warm milk with maybe some meat or something in it. I don't speak knowledgeably, by the way. I'm just sort of speaking from impressions I've had. Okay. So, why did the maid die of consumption for doing that? I don't know. Okay, and then that brings us up to here. Our next story. There it is. GS says, the lesson, heed your dog's instincts. Yes. Okay. Now, this next one is technically 2 stories, but I'm going to read them out of order because the first part kind of spoils part of the second part, and the first part doesn't really add much to the second part going into it. But this one is also from Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, translations by Jürgen Hubert, who you can check in the pinned comment below. This is called Kleines Clausthal, and it is about a fellow named Kleines Clausthal. There was once a cruel poacher in the Harz region. If he knew that there was game animals somewhere, then it was not safe from him. Then he heard that, in the midnight hour of Good Friday, a doe with her fawn could be seen that no one is supposed to shoot. But he only laughed about such things. Once, a short time before Easter, he was with merry company. At that occasion, people started to talk about the Kleines Clausthal. But as he didn't believe any of these warnings, he only laughed and said, "What's the matter? I will shoot the doe for you, and the fawn too. Then we shall eat it on the first holiday of Easter." While the others tried to dissuade him, but he would not listen. So on the eve of Good Friday, he went into the valley of Kleines Clausthal. When he arrived at the pond, he saw a high, dense fog hovering above it. The fog reached up to the sky, and it was impossible to see the pond itself. And there was whispering within the fog, as if many voices talked to each other. And there were glimpses of strange figures within. Above the path, too, many figures like merry shadows flitted closer, and they all vanished into the fog above the pond. But none of this did the poacher any harm. He walked past it and took position behind a shrub at the exit of the valley where the first stamp mill of the innerst is located. And indeed, the doe with her fawn appeared before him. He then shot the fawn, and he saw it fall. He leaped towards it, tied its feet together, and hung it over his shoulder. Then he set forth on the way back. When he arrived at the spot where the pond is located, he beheld a church at the site, where the pond had only been a short time ago. This church was brightly lit. Singing was clearly audible, and the organ played amidst it all. This is strange, he thought. I ought to go inside. Thus he stepped within, and there he saw that the church was full of people. But all of them looked as if they'd been within the grave for 100 years. Their clothes was of a fashion that was unfamiliar to him. He greeted, but nobody greeted him in return. A few nodded, others shook their head, waved at each other, and pointed with their fingers at him. Well, the lights on the altar and the lights on the chandelier burned with a blue flame that flickered out of the cup of the altar. One of the people within the church rose up and pointed him towards the door. The poacher, however, remained in place, looked into someone's hymn book, and wanted to sing along. Then someone else rose up and pointed towards the door, but he still did not leave and still wanted to sing along. But he could not read the writing and thus had to give up. Afterwards, the pastor stepped in front of the altar, but he spoke no human tongue. It was as if wind and thunder came out of the preacher's mouth. And suddenly a loud crack reverberated through the church as if the earth would end. Then the pastor pointed towards the visitor and shouted, "Accursed defiler of the Sabbath!" And the ghost rose up against him and howled those words in return, "Accursed defiler of the Sabbath!" Upon hearing this, the poacher rushed out of the church in fear and dread, and the door shut behind him with such force that his heels were torn off. Then he was thrown all the way to the path, and there he remained lying until the next morning. And as he regained consciousness, the pond was quiet. The fawn was gone. But he himself was deathly ill and was barely able to drag himself home after he had lingered on for 9 more days. He told his tale and died afterwards. I feel like maybe that one has a more obvious connection. And depending on which way you look at it. I mean, obviously he upset some supernatural force by being arrogant. But also, if you just got knocked out and laid in the rain all night, I imagine you could get sick. I will admit that we are further along in time than I thought we'd be. I'll just briefly read you part 1 of that, in case you're curious. It says, there was once a town near current-day Clausthal, which was called Kleines Clausthal. This town was supposedly very prosperous, but the richer the inhabitants became, the worse and more godless they behaved. For this, God had sunk the city, and a pond formed at the spot where the church used to stand. The valley is still called the Kleines Clausthal. The church can be seen regularly at midnight between Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday. At the same time, a doe can be seen which no one is supposed to hunt. Once the mountain monk seduced a miner into oversleeping, and after he woke up, he walked along the path that led to the Teichdam. There he saw the church of Kleines Clausthal, and he was quite astonished about this when he went inside, but he recognized no one among the people within the church, including the preacher. Then the mountain monk appeared before him again and led him outside, and when he proceeded onwards, the church and path leading to it were gone. So it's a different account of the same idea. The mountain monk is another idea that has tales around it that I'm not reading tonight because they're not relevant to our theme, but it is a thing in this volume. That's why they're referencing it. Gia says 9 days, multiples of 3. Yeah, we're going to see that a lot. And for those who don't know, that's an obvious... I mean, it's all pretty obvious references to the story of Jesus. Okay. We may not actually get through all of these, but let's see how far we make it. Our next story is called Räderberg Mountain. It comes from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles by Jürgen Hubert. And it is an oral tale. A butcher from Nassau went away from home in order to trade. On the highway, he soon encountered a coach traveling along the road. He walked after it, following its tracks while lost in thoughts. Suddenly it stopped in front of a beautiful, large country mansion in the middle of the highway. He had never seen this mansion before, no matter how often he had traveled along this route. 3 monks climbed out of the wagon, and the astonished butcher followed them unseen into the brightly lit house. First, they went into a room to conduct a rite. Then they went into a chamber where a large party of people sat around a table and devoured a meal accompanied by loud noises and shouting. Suddenly, the man sitting at the head of the table noticed the uninvited butcher, and immediately every noise was gone to silence. Then this man rose up and brought the butcher a cup of wine with the words, "Another day." Well, the butcher shuddered and did not want to drink. Soon after, another man rose up and walked towards the butcher with a cup, and again said, "Another day." The butcher refused again, and after that, a third person approached with a cup and the same words, "Another day." Now the butcher drank, but But soon after, a fourth person came closer to the butcher and offered wine yet again. The butcher became extremely scared, and after he made the sign of the cross, the entire scene vanished, and he found himself alone in thick darkness. When morning finally broke, the butcher found himself on the Räderberg mountain. Far away from the highway, he traveled a stony, exhausting path back to his hometown and related his experiences to the priest, and died exactly 3 days later. Now, there had long been a legend that a monastery used to be on that mountain. Its ruins are still visible, but the monastic order dwelling there has long since died out. Good luck figuring out the reason for that one. I mean, there's these allusions again to Jesus, right? Like there's the dying after 3 days as opposed to rising after 3 days. There's wine, which is, in Catholic and some other denominations, is a part of the Eucharist. For those who aren't religious, that's the bread and wine you take. It's the blood of Christ. What another day means, I don't know. And the translator doesn't know either, by the way. So go for it. Speculate wildly. Nobody knows what this means. But he died for it, and I guess that means he deserved it. Okay. We have 2 stories left. They're both relatively short, although this one's a little on the longer side. Let me double check something first. I don't know if we'll read that one today. I do like it, but it is the least related. It's more like a good story than anything else. But the next one is also probably the least related to our concept, but I don't know. I found it charming and it felt connected to me. So this is called A Dead Man Searches for His Gown. It is a German folktale translated by Jürgen Hubert in Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, who you can find pinned in a comment below. There was a graveyard surrounding the church of Alt Strelitz. In old times, and like today, the school was in front of it. The cantor lived within the school building. Once, when he happened to look out of the window around midnight, he noticed that a corpse stepped out of a grave, removed his burial ground, and walked away. However, relieving the cantor, soon after, the corpse reappeared, pulled the gown back over himself, and vanished back into the grave. Well, the cantor, whose attention was arrested by this, was next to the window the following night, you can bet that, and indeed saw that same scene replay itself. And on the third night, when the dead man had climbed out of the grave and departed, the gown was lying on the tombstone. The cantor, who was a brave man, to put it mildly, sneaked out of his room and retrieved that gown. When the dead man reappeared and didn't find his gown, well, he started a fearsome racket. Soon he knew where his clothing had been hidden, and when he spotted the thief in the window, forced him with threats to bring the gown outside. Well, the cantor initially did not want to give in, but nevertheless soon made his way to the embittered dead man. But when he reached the graveyard down below, the haunt jumped on his back and drove him into the church to the altar, and there the cantor had to say the words, "Forgotten and forgiven," 3 times. And when the cantor had said those words the first time, a voice from the distance replied, "Forgiven, but not forgotten." The same occurred the second and third time when the cantor said those words. Afterwards, the dead man hurried out of the church again with the cantor, and in front of the door gave him 2 terrible slaps. Subsequently, the cantor fell ill and died soon thereafter. What was the point of him doing penance if they were just going to kill him? Like, if that is indeed the message here. I feel so arbitrary to me, but that is the theme of the night, right? These kind of arbitrary deaths. Oh, what the heck. Let's read the last one. It's probably the least mysterious about how the person came to die. I will admit. This one will definitely take us out to the end. This one's on the sadder side of matters. GS says, slapped and died. True. Just give me a moment here. Our last story tonight also comes from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles. It deals with, I think, perhaps a less mysterious death than the others, and it is called the Uglei. Not far from Newton, there is a small lake within a beech grove. This lake is called the Uglei. Its dark waters are always calm and quiet, and everything around it appears sad and gloomy. The lake did not always exist, but it was a long time ago when it formed, and its story will certainly explain why things are sad and gloomy about it today. Up on the hill, where the summer residence is located now, there used to be a castle, inhabited by a young, handsome, but wild knight. He loved nothing more than hunting, and early every morning he ventured into the forest. On his way, he frequently encountered the daughter of a poor farmer who had to drive her father's horses into the woods for pasture. Well, that young wild knight soon fell deeply in love with her due to her beauty, but the girl refused his pleas and gifts and replied to all his courting that he could not possibly become his wife. She was only a poor man's daughter. And yet, the girl had come to care for the handsome knight as well. One morning, when he once more pursued her with his pleas and promises, they came to a depression in the forest where a small chapel was located. Then, The knight led the girl inside, and as he stepped before the altar, he spoke, "Here in the sight of God I will take you as my spouse, and heaven may strike me down at this place if I do not stay true to you and fail to keep my word." The girl believed his vow, and they met in the forest every morning. But when the girl reminded him of his promise, he first put it off, and eventually he stayed away and did not come back. When she realized that she had been abandoned, she put on a black dress, became depressed, fell sick, and died after a short time. I'll remind people that a black dress is a sign of mourning, and widows wear them. Meanwhile, the knight had become engaged to a rich countess, and the wedding day was set. The wedding was to take place in the small chapel in the forest, but when the preacher had finished his sermon and the bridal couple wanted to come together, the ghost of the unfortunate girl appeared and raised her finger against the groom. When he sank to the ground out of fright, a terrible storm with thunder. With that. And rain broke loose as if heaven itself was about to collapse. Then the chapel sunk into the waters, with everyone inside. And the lake has stood at this site since that time. Only the preacher, the bride, and a small innocent girl could be saved, since they had stepped on the wooden stairs of the altar. But at times, in evenings during quiet weather, it is still possible to hear the small bell of the chapel coming from those waters. Probably the least bewildering of the deaths. That's why I was saying it's the one that's the least on theme. I think what would put it on theme for me was, it's romantic to have somebody, die of a broken heart, but it's not particularly common as an explanation for death. So it was more about why she died and less about him. Anyhow, look at that. We came just under an hour, so let me not ruin it by rambling. Thank you so much, GS and Just Fleece It Out, for coming and watching this. A hard one to summarize. I hope you feel the connection as I did between these tales. I must say, coming up with a YouTube icon and like a concept in its title, this was a tough one to do because I couldn't put like the Hugh and the Vardøger because nobody would know what that meant. So hopefully you feel that I've done some justice to the title of the video and you don't feel missold on that. It certainly was a mixed bag of strange premonitions about banal deaths. GS says, the best night yet. Oh, well, thank you, GS. For me, coming up with, when I came across the Hugh, the Vardøger, and the Fylgje blog post from Simon Roy Hughes, it fascinated me. And I was like trying to find a way to sort it into a show. And so I'm glad that I finally found a way to do that. Thank you so much for dropping by and giving me a chance. If you enjoyed the show, consider liking the video because, YouTube is a cruel mistress. And if you want to keep tabs on when I'm doing stuff that interests you, consider subscribing. It'll give you little notifications of what that week's theme is. And if it interests you, you won't miss it. Beyond that, thank you so much for viewing. I look forward to, if anybody's willing to do it, to give me the theories on why the people died or how they died even in the comments over the week. And beyond that, I've been Rory. I'll keep the fire going for you. you have yourself a good sleep.